The gates closed behind you with a sound like a prison door slamming. You stood in a bare courtyard, holding your mother's hand on one side and your little sister S on the other. A woman in a gray dress with a face like carved stone walked toward you. She didn't introduce herself. She just looked at the three of you with the expression people use when examining something unpleasant they have to deal with. Then she spoke. Men to the left building, women to the right, children to the rear. Your mother's hand tightened on yours. She tried to speak, tried to say you were a family, that you needed to stay together. The woman cut her off. Rules are rules, no exceptions. Two men in rough uniforms stepped forward. One grabbed your mother. One grabbed your sister. They were pulling you apart, and your mother was screaming your name and your sister was crying, reaching for you. You tried to hold on, but the man was stronger. He dragged your mother toward one building while another took your sister in a different direction. You were pushed toward a third entrance. The last thing you saw was your mother's face, tears streaming down her cheeks, mouthing words you couldn't hear. You were 9 years old. Your father had died 2 months ago. Your mother had lost the room you'd been living in when she couldn't pay rent. And now you were here, the workhouse, where families were destroyed as official policy, where being poor meant being punished, where you just learned that asking for help meant losing everything you had left. Victorian England in the mid to late 1800s operated under the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. This law established a national system of workhouses designed specifically to make poverty so unbearable that people would do anything to avoid them. The principle was called less eligibility. It meant that conditions in the workhouse had to be worse than the worst conditions outside, worse than the poorest laborer's life, worse than living on the streets. The logic was cruel and deliberate. If you made the workhouse horrible enough, only the truly desperate would enter. Everyone else would find work at any wage under any conditions to avoid it. The workhouse wasn't charity. It was deterrence. It was punishment for being poor. And it was designed by people who believed that poverty was a moral failing, that poor people were lazy and needed harsh treatment to motivate them. So the workhouses were built like prisons, high walls, locked gates, strict rules, and a system of family separation that destroyed the one thing poor people still had, each other. Thomas Brennan was 9 when his family entered the Whitechapel workhouse in London. His father had worked in the docks until a falling cargo crate crushed his legs. He'd lingered for 3 weeks before infection killed him. Thomas's mother tried to support the family by taking in washing, but the pay was almost nothing. 1 shilling for a full day's work scrubbing clothes until her hands bled. It wasn't enough. They were evicted. They had nowhere to go. The workhouse was the only option. Thomas walked through those gates with his mother, his 6-year-old sister Mary, and his infant brother James. He thought they'd at least be together. He was wrong. The moment they entered, they were separated. Thomas was taken to the boys' ward, his sister to the girls', his mother to the women's section with the baby. They could see each other briefly on Sundays during chapel, but they couldn't speak, couldn't touch, couldn't sit together. The workhouse administrators believed that family contact encouraged dependency and weakened moral character. So families were kept apart, deliberately, systematically, as punishment for being poor. The boys' ward was a large room with rows of narrow beds, 60 boys aged 5 to 14 packed together. The beds were wooden platforms with thin straw mattresses that were never changed. They were infested with lice and bedbugs. You'd wake up covered in bites, scratching until you bled. The room was freezing in winter. No heat except what came from 60 bodies pressed together. In summer it was stifling, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the bucket in the corner that served as the communal toilet. You woke at 5:30 to a bell. You had 10 minutes to dress and line up. Then inspection. The master would walk down the line looking for infractions. Dirty hands, uncombed hair, talking. Any violation meant punishment. Thomas was punished on his 2nd day for having dirt under his fingernails. The master hit him across the knuckles with a wooden rod. 3 sharp strikes that made his hand swell. Then he was sent to stand in the corner for 2 hours before breakfast. Breakfast was gruel. Watery oatmeal with no salt, no sugar, nothing to make it edible, just paste that sat in your stomach like a rock. You ate it because there was nothing else. If you didn't finish it, you were punished. If you asked for more, you were punished. The portions were calculated to be just enough to keep you alive, never enough to satisfy hunger. After breakfast came work. For the boys, that meant oakum picking. You were given a pile of old rope, thick and tarred and hard as wood. Your job was to unravel it fiber by fiber. Your fingers would bleed within an hour. The tar got into the cuts and burned. But you had a quota. If you didn't meet it, you didn't get dinner. Thomas picked oakum for 8 hours a day. His hands were destroyed within a week. The skin on his fingertips cracked open. His nails split. The other boys had the same injuries. Some had infections that turned their hands red and swollen. There was no medical care. The workhouse doctor visited once a month, glanced at whoever was dying and left. Everything else you just lived with. The pain, the infections, the slow destruction of your body. You were 9 years old and your hands looked like an old man's. Gnarled, scarred, permanently damaged, and the work never stopped. Day after day, week after week, the same rope, the same blood, the same crushing boredom and pain. This was childhood in the workhouse. This was what asking for help meant. There was no kindness. The workhouse masters and matrons were chosen for their harshness. Compassion was seen as weakness. If you were soft on the inmates, they'd take advantage. That was the belief. So the staff were deliberately cruel. They'd hit children for minor infractions. They'd withhold food as punishment. They'd force children to stand for hours in stress positions. They'd put children in isolation cells, small dark rooms where you'd be locked for days. Thomas saw a boy named Peter locked up for stealing an extra piece of bread. Peter was in that cell for 3 days with no food and minimal water. When they let him out, he could barely walk. His eyes were vacant. He didn't speak for a week. The masters called it discipline. It was torture, and it happened constantly. Children were beaten daily, starved regularly, broken systematically, because the workhouse existed to crush poverty out of people, to make being poor so awful that you'd do anything to escape. And if children were destroyed in the process, that was acceptable. They were poor children. Their suffering didn't matter. If you were Thomas, 9 years old and separated from your family, your hands bleeding from forced labor, your body starving, living in a system designed to break you, what would you have held on to? What would have kept you from giving up completely when every single day was punishment for something you hadn't done wrong? Disease was constant. With so many people crammed together in unsanitary conditions, illness spread like wildfire. Typhus, cholera, tuberculosis, scarlet fever. Once someone got sick, everyone got sick. There was no quarantine, no isolation. You just kept working and hoped you didn't catch it. Thomas watched children die regularly. A boy in the bed next to him developed a fever. Within 3 days, he was delirious. On the 4th day, he was dead. They removed the body at night and put another boy in the same bed the next day. The mattress wasn't even changed. Death was so common it barely registered. The masters would note it in their records and move on. Another bed available. Another spot for a new inmate. Thomas's infant brother James died when Thomas had been in the workhouse for 4 months. James caught whooping cough. His tiny body couldn't fight it. He coughed until he couldn't breathe, and then he stopped breathing altogether. Thomas's mother held him while he died. Thomas didn't learn about it until Sunday chapel, when he saw his mother's face and knew something was wrong. He wasn't allowed to go to the funeral. Neither was his sister Mary. Their mother buried James alone in the workhouse cemetery, a plot of land behind the building where hundreds of paupers were buried in unmarked graves. Thomas never got to say goodbye to his brother. Never got to grieve properly. He just had to keep picking oakum, keep following the rules, keep existing in the system that had killed James as surely as any disease. But here's what makes the Victorian workhouse system even more evil. It was designed by people who had alternatives, who knew better, who had access to information showing that poverty was caused by economic factors, not moral failure. Reports were written, studies were conducted. Reformers like Charles Dickens wrote novels exposing workhouse conditions. Everyone knew what was happening inside those walls, and the system continued for decades because it served a purpose. It terrified the working poor. If you had a job, no matter how bad, no matter how low the wages, you'd cling to it rather than risk the workhouse. If you were unemployed, you'd accept any work, any conditions, anything rather than go through those gates. The workhouse kept wages low and workers compliant. It was a tool of economic control disguised as charity, and the people running the system knew this. The poor law commissioners, the workhouse boards, the wealthy men who designed and funded these institutions, they knew they were torturing poor people. They just didn't care, because the system worked for them. It kept the poor desperate and docile. It preserved social order. It protected property and wealth. And if thousands of children died in the process, if families were destroyed, if human beings were ground down until they broke, that was an acceptable cost. Think about the social safety nets that exist today. Unemployment benefits, food assistance, homeless shelters. Imperfect as they are, they're based on the idea that people deserve help without being tortured. Now imagine those replaced with a system designed specifically to punish you for needing help, to separate you from your family, to starve and work you until you'd rather die than stay. Could you survive it? Would you want to? Most people who entered the workhouse didn't leave. They died there, or they became so institutionalized they couldn't function outside. Thomas lasted 3 years. By the time he was 12, he was a shell. His body was stunted from malnutrition. His hands were permanently damaged from oakum picking. His spirit was completely broken. He didn't laugh, didn't play, didn't express emotion. He just existed, moving through the daily routine like a machine. His sister Mary had been apprenticed out when she turned 10, sent to work in a textile mill. Thomas never saw her again. His mother was still in the women's ward, but Thomas caught glimpses of her on Sundays and barely recognized her. She'd aged 20 years in 3. Her hair had gone gray. Her face was gaunt. Her eyes were empty. The workhouse had destroyed her completely. One Sunday, Thomas noticed his mother wasn't in chapel. He asked the matron what had happened. The woman said his mother had died, fever, 3 days ago, already buried. Thomas felt nothing. He'd been drained of the ability to feel. He just nodded and went back to his seat. Thomas tried to run away 2 weeks after his mother's death. He climbed a wall at night and dropped into the alley behind the workhouse. He ran through the dark streets with no plan, no destination, just desperate to escape. He made it 3 days, sleeping in doorways, begging for food. Then he was caught by a constable who recognized him as a workhouse runaway. He was returned. The punishment for running was severe. He was stripped, beaten with a cane until his back was bloody, then locked in an isolation cell for a week with minimal food and water. When they let him out, Thomas was barely conscious. They put him back in the boys' ward and back to work the next day. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold the rope, but he met his quota. Because the alternative was worse. 6 months later, Thomas developed a cough. It started small but grew worse. He couldn't breathe properly. He was coughing up blood. Tuberculosis, probably. The workhouse doctor glanced at him and said nothing could be done. Thomas kept working as long as he could. When he finally collapsed, they moved him to the infirmary, a room where the dying were put to wait for death. Thomas died on a cold morning in February. He was 12 years old. He'd spent 3 years in the workhouse, 3 years of hunger, pain, labor, and isolation. He was buried in the same unmarked cemetery as his brother and his mother. No stone, no marker, just another body in the ground. The workhouse noted his death in the register. Boy age 12, cause of death consumption. That was all. His entire life reduced to one line. And the next day, another child took his bed and the system continued. The workhouses operated for decades. Hundreds of thousands of people passed through them. Families were separated. Children died. Lives were destroyed. All in the name of deterring poverty. All based on the belief that poor people deserved to suffer. And Victorian England prospered. The Industrial Revolution created unprecedented wealth. The British Empire expanded across the globe. Cities grew. Factories multiplied. Progress was celebrated. And it was all built on the backs of people like Thomas. People who were punished for being poor. People who were worked to death to keep the economy running and the working class terrified. The workhouse wasn't an aberration, it was a feature, a deliberate tool of economic and social control, and the people who designed and defended it weren't ignorant. They were calculating. They knew exactly what they were doing. They chose cruelty. They chose family separation. They chose starvation and abuse and death because it served their interests, because it protected their wealth and power, because poor people's suffering was less important than maintaining the social order that benefited the rich. Even after the workhouses were finally reformed and eventually closed in the early 20th century, their legacy remained. The belief that poverty is a moral failing, that people who need help should be made to suffer for it, that the poor should be grateful for whatever scraps they receive and ask for nothing more. Those attitudes didn't disappear. They just evolved, found new language, new policies. The workhouse is gone, but the impulse that created it, the willingness to punish poverty rather than address its causes, that impulse is still here, still shaping how we treat the vulnerable, still deciding who deserves help and who deserves to suffer. Thomas died in a workhouse in 1870-something, but the system that killed him, the belief system that said his suffering was acceptable and necessary, that's still alive, still operating, still grinding down the poor while the wealthy prosper. The workhouse may be history, but its lesson is eternal. When society chooses to punish poverty instead of addressing it, the poor pay with their lives. And no one with power cares enough to stop it.